Thomas's body was found inside a plastic bin in the back of an SUV in Southfield about a year ago. Her boyfriend is getting ready to face a jury. But as Gino Vici reports, his mother wants her charges tossed.
Again, the cause of death was ruled asphyxiation. Jalen and Charla Pendergrass were both charged with murder and tampering with evidence. Charla was also charged with unlawful imprisonment. But that witness testimony Johnson wants thrown out states that Charla struck and killed London with an object, which again, Johnson says there is no such evidence to support that claim.
But the autopsy report also says there were no injuries to the head. So it's completely contradictory. And now to come forth and argue that the medical examiner missed this, they didn't miss anything.
After hearing the prosecutor and defense argue about this evidence, the judge says he needs more time to decide.
A plastic storage bin sat inside an SUV parked outside a house on Millard Street in Southfield, Michigan. It had been there for weeks, sealed, quiet. Nobody on that street knew what was inside it. Neighbors walked past that SUV to get their mail. Kids rode bikes past it. Nobody thought twice about a bin in a car. Then, on April 26, 2025, police pulled that bin open. Inside was the body of a 17-year-old girl named London Thomas. She had been missing for 2 weeks. Her family had been searching for her, praying for her, begging anyone with information to come forward. And the whole time, she was inside a sealed bin, sitting in an SUV, a few miles from where she was last seen alive. This is the story of how London Thomas disappeared, how a lie almost let her killers walk free, and how a mother and son turned a breakup into a murder. A girl went to see a boy she used to date. She never came back out. And 2 people who should have picked up a phone and called for help instead spent weeks trying to make sure nobody ever found out what they had done. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is just how long it took the truth to catch up. London Thomas was 17 years old. She lived in the Detroit area, in a family that loved her fiercely. Her father, Cedric Salisbury, and her grandmother, Justina Martin, were part of her life in the way that matters most in families like theirs. They showed up. They asked where she was. They worried when they didn't hear from her. Like a lot of teenagers, London had a boyfriend. His name was Jalen Pendergrass. He was 23 years old, 6 years older than her. He lived in Inkster, a small city just outside Detroit, in Wayne County, in a house on Carlisle Street that he shared with his mother, Charla Pendergrass. Relationships between teenagers and adults in their 20s are never simple, and this one wasn't either. A 6-year age gap between a teenager and a man in his 20s is the kind of detail that, looking back, makes people uneasy. It's the kind of detail that gets mentioned quietly at family gatherings, the kind an older sister might raise an eyebrow at, the kind a father might not love, but might not fight either, because his daughter is 17, and 17-year-olds don't always want to hear what their fathers think about who they're dating. By the spring of 2025, London and Jalen's relationship had ended. Breakups between teenagers and their partners rarely follow a straight line, though. There's often a version of over that still leaves a door cracked open, a text that gets answered, a reason to swing by, an argument that isn't quite finished. Whatever it was that pulled London back to that house on Carlisle Street one more time, it wasn't unusual. Exes go back. They talk. They try to close things out properly, or they can't quite let go, or there's simply unfinished business. A phone charger left behind, a conversation that needs an ending. That decision to go back one more time would be the last one she ever made. Inkster isn't a big place. It's a small city just west of Detroit, the kind of town where houses sit close together on quiet residential streets, where neighbors know each other's cars, where nothing much happens that everyone doesn't hear about eventually. Carlisle Street looks like a lot of streets in that part of southeast Michigan. Modest homes, front porches, driveways that fit one car if you're lucky. It's not the kind of place you picture when you think about a murder. That's part of what makes this story so unsettling. It didn't happen in some dark alley or abandoned building. It happened inside an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, In a city where people go to work and raise their kids, and mostly just want to be left alone. London was still in high school. She was still figuring out who she was going to be, the way every 17-year-old is. She had people who loved her, who expected to see her grow up, graduate, maybe move out on her own one day, maybe come back for holidays with her own stories to tell. That's the future everyone assumes is coming for a teenager. Nobody in her family was planning for anything else. On April 5, 2025, London's sister dropped her off at Jalen's house on Carlisle Street in Inkster. It was a small, unremarkable moment, the kind of thing that happens every day between siblings. A ride, a drop-off, a quick goodbye. Nobody could have known it would be the last time anyone in London's family would see her alive. By the time London arrived, her relationship with Jalen was over. Prosecutors would later say that clearly, the two were broken up when she showed up at his house that day. Whatever brought her back, a conversation that needed finishing, belongings to collect, unresolved feelings, we may never know the full details. What we do know is that once she walked through that door, she never walked back out. London Thomas vanished. Somewhere, on that same ordinary Saturday, other families in Inkster were doing normal Saturday things, cutting grass, running errands, watching a game. Nobody driving down Carlisle Street that afternoon would have noticed anything different about the house where Jalen Pendergrass lived with his mother. No commotion, no sirens, just a house like any other, holding something nobody outside its walls could have imagined. That's often how it goes with cases like this. The worst things don't announce themselves. They happen quietly, behind ordinary doors, while the rest of the world keeps moving at its normal pace outside. When a teenager goes quiet, families notice fast. Calls go unanswered. Texts sit there, delivered but not read. A gut feeling creeps in that something is wrong. London's family reported her missing to Detroit police. And then came the hardest part of any missing person's case. The waiting. Flyers. Phone calls to friends. Reaching out to anyone who might have seen her. Days stacking on top of each other with no answers. Detroit police would have logged her as a missing juvenile. Her photo would have gone out to officers on patrol. Her name would have been entered into databases that connect to other cities, other counties, in case she turned up somewhere unexpected. A hospital, a shelter, a police stop 3 states away. This is the machinery that kicks in when a teenager disappears, and it is often frustratingly slow, because most missing teenagers, statistically, come home safely within days. Officers, understandably, don't treat every missing 17-year-old as a worst-case scenario right away. Most of the time, they're right not to. This time, they would have been wrong. For 2 weeks, nobody could say where London Thomas was. Her family didn't have the luxury of statistics. They had an empty bed, a phone that didn't ring, and a growing, sick feeling that grows heavier with every day that passes in a case like this. Anyone who has waited by a phone for news about a missing loved one knows that particular kind of exhaustion, the way you snap awake at 3 a.m., convinced you heard a text come in, the way ordinary sounds start to feel like signals, the way you can't fully breathe until you know. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Jalen Pendergrass became a person of interest in her disappearance early on. Investigators were looking at him. But a person of interest isn't the same as a suspect with enough evidence to arrest. And so, for those 16 days, he was not charged with anything. Meanwhile, his mother, Charla Pendergrass, was about to make a decision that would eventually help unravel the whole case, but not before she tried to cover something up. According to investigators, on April 6, the day after London arrived at the Pendergrass home, Charla Pendergrass called a friend of hers. She asked him for a favor, help her move a sealed plastic bin. She didn't tell him what was inside. He didn't ask. He agreed. Days later, on April 11th, that friend helped move the bin again, this time placing it inside an SUV parked at a house on Millard Street in Southfield, a city bordering Detroit, about a 20-minute drive from Inkster. For weeks, That bin sat there, sealed, silent. Nobody knew, and nobody thought to ask, what a random plastic storage container was doing sitting in the back of a parked SUV. Think about how ordinary that is. Storage bins sit in garages and trunks and SUVs all over every neighborhood in America. People move, people declutter, people haul boxes of old clothes to donation centers. A sealed bin in a parked car isn't the kind of thing that makes anyone stop and stare. That's exactly why it worked, for a little while. Hiding something in plain sight only requires everyone around you to keep minding their own business, and most of the time, people do. But the friend who moved it never forgot about it. Maybe it nagged at him. Maybe he started putting pieces together once London's face began showing up on the news as a missing teenager. Whatever changed his mind, on April 26, 2025, he did something that would break the case wide open. He told the FBI what he knew. Federal agents and local police moved quickly once they got that tip. They tracked down the SUV on Millard Street. They opened the bin. Inside was London Thomas. 2 weeks after she disappeared from a house in Inkster, London was found less than 20 minutes away, sealed inside a container, left in a vehicle, like an old piece of furniture nobody wanted anymore. The Oakland County Medical Examiner's Office performed an autopsy. The cause of death? Asphyxia. In plain terms, London Thomas had been suffocated. Her death was officially ruled a homicide. For her family, the news ended one kind of pain and began another. The uncertainty was over, but so was any hope that London was still alive somewhere, that she'd walk back through a door one day with an explanation. Now they had to carry the truth instead of the question mark. There's a strange, cruel mercy in getting an answer, even a terrible one. Families who never find their missing loved ones spend years, sometimes decades, unable to grieve properly because they can't be sure what they're grieving. London's family didn't have that particular torment waiting for them. What they had instead was the specific, physical horror of knowing exactly what happened to her, that she had been suffocated, sealed away, and left in a vehicle like refuse. It's a different kind of pain, not lesser, just different. Certainty doesn't soften a loss, it just changes its shape. In the days after London's body was found, police arrested Charla Pendergrass, but not for murder. Not yet. She was initially charged with lying to a peace officer. Here's what prosecutors said happened. Charla told an investigator that she had seen London leave the Inkster house on April 5th, the same day London arrived. That statement wasn't true, according to authorities. London never left that house on her own. She never left it alive. It was a small lie, with a big purpose. If people believed London had walked out of that house safely, then whatever happened to her afterward had nothing to do with the people living there. It could point investigators anywhere else, toward strangers, toward the streets, toward anyone but the Pendergrass family. But the lie hit a legal snag that had nothing to do with whether it was true. The officer Charla allegedly lied to turned out to be a federal agent, not a local police officer. Under Michigan law, a peace officer has a specific legal definition, and a federal agent doesn't fit inside it. Because of that technicality, prosecutors couldn't make the lying charge stick. It was dropped during Charla's preliminary court hearing. For a moment, it might have looked like the case against her was falling apart before it had really started. It wasn't. It was just getting started in a different direction, one that would end with far more serious charges than lying to an officer. It's worth sitting with how close that legal technicality came to mattering. If the person Charla allegedly lied to had been a Michigan police officer instead of a federal agent, that charge might have stuck, and it might have been the only charge she ever faced, a relatively minor one compared to what came later. Instead, the dismissal of that charge turned out to be a footnote, not an ending. Investigators didn't stop building their case just because one piece of it got knocked down in court. They kept working, and eventually, they came back with something far heavier than a lying charge. Between the spring and the fall of 2025, investigators kept working, They didn't just have a body and a lie anymore. They had a friend willing to talk about a bin. They had a timeline. April 5th, the drop-off. April 6th, the first request to move the bin. April 11th, the bin placed in the SUV. April 26th, the discovery. They had an autopsy that told them how London died, and they had a relationship, a broken-up teenage romance between a 17-year-old girl and a 23-year-old man that gave them a motive to explore. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy's office built the case piece by piece. It took about 6 months. That's a long time for a family to wait, knowing their daughter is gone and her killer might still be walking free. But on October 16th, 2025, that waiting produced results. Jalen Pendergrass, 23, and his mother, Charla Pendergrass, 49, were both charged with second-degree murder and evidence tampering. Mother and son, charged together, accused together of killing a 17-year-old girl and then working together to hide what they'd done. Second-degree murder, under Michigan law, means prosecutors don't have to prove the killing was planned out in advance, the way first-degree murder charges require. It still means an intentional, malicious act that caused a death, just not one prosecutors are alleging was premeditated for days or weeks beforehand. Evidence tampering, the second charge, pointed straight at that bin, moving it, hiding it, trying to make sure nobody ever connected it to a missing teenager. 6 months is a long time to build a case, but it's not unusual for one this serious. Prosecutors don't file second-degree murder charges against two people, including a victim's own former boyfriend and his mother, without being confident they can back it up in court. Every phone record, every witness statement, every piece of forensic evidence from that SUV and that bin needed to be gathered, verified, and organized into something a jury, or, as it turned out, a judge accepting a plea, could rely on. The next morning, October 17th, 2025, Jalen and Charla Pendergrass stood in front of a judge at the 22nd District Court for their arraignment. Charla stood quietly, dressed in a sweatshirt. Jalen stood beside her in an orange jumpsuit. Outside the courtroom, London's family finally had a moment they'd been waiting 6 months for. Her father, Cedric Salisbury, told reporters it had been an emotional roller coaster, heartbreaking, but he said his family had held on to their faith that this day would come. He said people close to the family had believed all along that Jalen and Charla were responsible, and now, finally, that belief was being taken seriously by the courts. London's grandmother, Justina Martin, wasn't as measured. She looked at the two defendants and said something was clearly wrong with them, especially with Jalen. She said they needed to be kept off the streets, that it wasn't safe for other families' kids while they were free. The judge set Charla's bond at $5 million in cash, ordered her to wear a GPS tether, and barred her from leaving the state of Michigan. Jalen, meanwhile, was held without bond, partly because of the murder charge, and partly because he was already facing separate charges in a different case out of Oakland County. Both were scheduled to return to court the following week for a probable cause hearing. The case was moving. Slowly, but moving. For a family grieving a murdered daughter, every court date is its own kind of ordeal. Probable cause hearings, pre-trial hearings, motions, continuances. The criminal justice system does not move at the speed of grief. It moves at the speed of evidence, paperwork, attorneys' schedules, and judges' calendars. Through the fall and winter, the case against Jalen and Charla Pendergrass worked its way through Wayne County's courts, and the charges stayed serious: second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and, at various points, felony murder and unlawful imprisonment were also part of the discussion around Jalen's case. Behind every one of those legal terms was the same plain fact. A teenage girl went to a house to see her ex-boyfriend, and she never came home. On July 2nd, 2026, more than a year after London disappeared, Jalen Pendergrass stood in a Wayne County courtroom and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. As part of the plea agreement, the other charges against him, evidence tampering, felony murder, and unlawful imprisonment were dismissed. That's how plea deals often work. Prosecutors accept a guilty plea to one serious charge in exchange for dropping others, avoiding the uncertainty and the length of a full trial, and guaranteeing that the person responsible is held accountable for something, instead of risking an acquittal on everything. Guilty pleas can be unsatisfying to watch from the outside. There's no dramatic cross-examination, no jury filing back into a courtroom after hours of deliberation, no verdict read aloud to gasps and tears. A plea is quieter than that. It's a defendant standing up, answering a series of questions from a judge, and saying, on the record, that yes, he did this. For a lot of families, that quiet moment carries more weight than any trial could. There's no chance of a surprise acquittal. No chance a clever defense attorney convinces 12 strangers to see reasonable doubt where the family sees only certainty. The person responsible said it himself, in his own voice, in front of everyone. Jalen Pendergrass is scheduled to be sentenced on July 31st, 2026. His mother's case is still moving through the courts separately. Charla Pendergrass is expected to appear for a pre-trial hearing on the same day her son is sentenced, July 31st. For London's family, the guilty plea was another milestone in a case that had already taken far longer than a year of pain should take. It wasn't a trial. It wasn't a jury's verdict read aloud in a packed courtroom. But it was Jalen Pendergrass, in his own words, admitting in front of a judge that he murdered London Thomas. Strip away the court dates and the legal terms, and what's left is simple, and it's the kind of simple that never stops hurting. London Thomas was 17 years old. She had a father who loved her enough to stand outside a courthouse and tell reporters about his faith that justice would come. She had a grandmother who wasn't afraid to say, out loud, in public, that the people who hurt her granddaughter were dangerous and needed to be locked away. She had a life that was supposed to keep going. More birthdays, maybe graduation, maybe a job, maybe her own family one day. Every ordinary thing that a 17-year-old is supposed to get to have. Instead, she went to a house in Inkster on April 5, 2025, to see a boy she used to date, and within days, according to prosecutors, that boy and his mother had suffocated her, sealed her body in a plastic bin, and moved that bin from house to house like it was nothing more than clutter to be hidden. It sat in an SUV on Millard Street for weeks. People walked past it. Life went on around it, the way life does, not knowing what was 6 feet away. It took a phone call to the FBI from a man who had unknowingly helped move a dead girl's body to finally end the search. It took an autopsy to tell London's family exactly how she died. It took 6 months of investigative work to bring charges, and it took over a year, total, from the day she went missing to the day the man responsible stood up in court and admitted what he did. As of this writing, Jalen Pendergrass is waiting to be sentenced on July 31st, 2026, for the second-degree murder of London Thomas. Second-degree murder in Michigan can carry a sentence of up to life in prison, though the exact term is determined by the judge at sentencing, taking into account the plea agreement and the specifics of the case. Charla Pendergrass's case is still open. She has not pleaded guilty. She's expected back in court on the same day as her son's sentencing for a pre-trial hearing on her own charges. Whatever happens to her will be a separate chapter, decided separately, in front of a different set of eyes. For London Thomas's family, none of this brings her back. No sentence, no matter how long, changes the fact that a 17-year-old girl went to see an ex-boyfriend one spring afternoon and never came home again. But after a missing persons search that lasted 16 days, a discovery that confirmed everyone's worst fear, a false statement that almost worked, and a year and a half of court dates, they have something they didn't have before. They have an answer. And soon, they'll have accountability, at least for one of the 2 people accused of taking London away from them. Her father said it best, standing outside that courtroom back in October. They held on to their faith that this day would come. It did. And on July 31st, another one will follow it. There's a temptation, in stories like this, to look for some larger lesson. A warning to teenagers about who they date. A lesson about trusting the wrong people. A tidy moral that makes the whole thing feel like it happened for a reason. But cases like London's resist that kind of tidy ending, because the truth is simpler and harder to sit with. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect someone are the ones who hurt them instead, and there's no lesson in that, except the obvious one, that it should never have happened. London Thomas didn't do anything wrong. She went to see someone she used to care about. That's it. That's the whole thing she's being remembered for doing. Everything that came after, the disappearance, the bin, the lie, the year and a half of court dates, was done to her, not because of anything she chose. Somewhere in Michigan, a father and a grandmother are still waking up every day without her. A sentencing date on a calendar won't change that, but it will mean that the system that took too long to find her didn't fail to hold at least one person accountable for taking her away. For a family that spent 16 days not knowing, and then over a year fighting to see justice done, that has to count for something. It's not everything. It's not London back, but it's not nothing either.